Walking through the streets of major cities in the United States or Canada, you often encounter people sleeping near subway grates, relying on the warm air that rises from below. People huddled in stairwell corners or staggering and mumbling to themselves. Syringes openly discarded on the streets. And people stumbling around in drug-induced stupors. In contrast, similar scenes are rarely visible when walking through major Korean cities. Of course, Korea has homeless people too. But the sight of people wandering the streets under the influence of drugs is extremely rare. So why are the street scenes so different? While the proportion of drug addicts is lower compared to the US and Canada, I believe it's not because Korea has no problem, but rather because of a structure where the problem isn't visible. The reason for the current proliferation of drug addicts in North America lies in medical painkillers. This disaster began through legal channels. In the late 1990s, the American pharmaceutical company, Purdue Pharma, launched a powerful painkiller called OxyContin, advertising it as having less than 1% addiction risk. Doctors believed this and prescribed it in large quantities to chronic pain patients. The problem was that this drug belonged to the opioid family. Opioids are derived from opium and, while providing powerful pain relief, they also induce extreme euphoria. Because they directly stimulate the brain's reward circuits, addiction becomes inevitable with repeated use. Furthermore, according to reports, the medical journal Lancet noted that the COVID-19 pandemic intensified the opioid crisis. Experts analyzed that as the medical system was shaken by COVID-19, people became dependent on familiar drugs. And social distancing led to increased cases of solitary drug use. People who initially received legal prescriptions gradually developed tolerance and required higher doses. When doctors stopped prescriptions, patients turned to the illegal market, to heroin and then to fentanyl, which is 50 times more powerful than heroin. Fentanyl was originally an anesthetic used during surgery. However, as it was illegally manufactured and entered the streets, deaths skyrocketed. In 2022 alone, over 100,000 people in the US died from drug overdoses, with more than 70% being fentanyl-related. Canada faces the same situation. In British Columbia, an average of more than 6 people per day die from drug overdoses. Vancouver's downtown east side now bears the dishonor of being called North America's drug addiction capital. In Korea, fentanyl patches and morphine injections are only provided to cancer patients or those with severe pain, and all prescriptions are recorded and tracked. More importantly, there's a socio-cultural taboo. In Korea, drugs are considered absolute evil. When celebrities are caught with drug charges, they are socially buried, and even their families face shame. This powerful social stigma paradoxically serves as a defensive barrier that lowers drug accessibility. Of course, Korea has drug problems too. It's just that they don't manifest in a visible form on the streets. Most drug addicts are homeless. And the homeless problem is also influenced by differences in welfare systems. In other words, there are differences in determining who qualifies for help. The U.S. welfare system is structured to screen those who deserve help. Food stamps, Medicaid, and housing assistance programs all have strict conditions: income verification, a fixed address, identification, and in some states, passing a drug test are required. But people who are already homeless lack an address and identification and fail drug tests. Ultimately, those who need help the most are pushed outside the system. Canada has public health care, but mental health services are separate. Counseling and rehabilitation programs mostly require out-of-pocket payment, and waiting times can stretch for months. Acute addicts cannot wait for months. Korea has a minimum universal safety net including national health insurance, basic livelihood security, housing benefits, and mental health welfare centers. But this system also has many loopholes. Eligibility conditions are strict, and it's difficult to receive support if you have family. However, at least extreme situations where people are driven to the streets with nowhere to go are less common than in North America. U.S. medical costs are the most expensive in the world. A hospital stay can easily cost tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Drug addiction rehabilitation programs are even more expensive. Even with insurance, coverage is often limited. And without insurance, access is virtually impossible. As a result, addicts remain untreated and are driven to the streets. The same applies to mental illness. If people with severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder don't receive treatment, they try to self-medicate their suffering with drugs, ultimately leading to street life. Canada has a public healthcare system, but mental health and addiction treatment are separate. Basic care is free, but specialized counseling, psychotherapy, and rehabilitation programs have high out-of-pocket costs and long waiting times. In Toronto or Vancouver, you have to wait months to see a psychiatric specialist. No one in an acute addiction state can wait months. They end up repeatedly visiting emergency rooms and returning to the streets. In Korea, psychiatric care is covered by health insurance. Of course, there are copayments, but they're incomparably cheaper than in the US. Mental health welfare centers operate nationwide, and free counseling and treatment connections are available. Integrated addiction management support centers also exist, providing free counseling and rehabilitation programs for alcohol, gambling, and drug addicts. Of course, few people seek help voluntarily due to stigma, and many cases involve family members bringing them forcibly. However, at least cases of ending up on the streets due to inability to afford treatment are much less common than in North America. North American society emphasizes individual freedom and responsibility. Success is individual effort, and failure is also individual responsibility. This logic also applies to addiction and homelessness. Why don't they work? Why can't they quit drugs? That's their own choice. Such views further isolate addicts and the homeless from society. Families often distance themselves, saying, "You handle it yourself." As a result, people with nowhere to turn for help end up on the streets. They become homeless in parks, subway stations, and in front of shopping malls, visible to passers-by. Korea is the opposite. A family member's problem is considered the entire family's shame. So families actively intervene. Alcohol addicts are forcibly hospitalized by family. Gambling addicts have their debts paid by family who then monitor them. And drug addicts are reported to police by family and connected to treatment. The merits of this intervention are debatable. But what's clear is that cases of being driven to the streets are fewer. Also, Korea's homeless tend to stay in hidden spaces like Jim Jilbang's PC rooms, small rooms, and goshiwons rather than on the streets. They try not to be visible due to social stigma, and families try to hide them as much as possible. In other words, North America has visible homelessness, while Korea has hidden homelessness. Mental illness and drug addiction often go hand in hand. According to U.S. surveys, approximately 45% of homeless people suffer from mental illness, drug addiction, or both. Even with mental illness, people use drugs to self-medicate their pain and suffering due to cost burden or fear of stigma, which intensifies addiction, inevitably leading to a vicious cycle of worsening mental illness. In Korea, forced hospitalization is possible under the Mental Health and Welfare Act, with the consent of two guardians and a psychiatric diagnosis. While this raises human rights concerns, it serves to prevent extreme neglect. Also, there are cases where families intervene to take them to hospitals, or police take emergency hospitalization measures. Due to this system, cases of mentally ill people being neglected on the streets are fewer than in North America. However, recently in Korea too, this safety net is weakening due to family breakdown, increasing single-person households, and growing isolation. Recently in North America, there's a movement to view drugs as an illness rather than a crime. For example, Vancouver, Canada operates safe drug injection facilities. But reality is complex. Instead, public drug use has increased in public spaces, and crime rates have risen. Korea strictly regulates through the Narcotics Control Act. Use, possession, and sale are all punishable. Even first-time offenders can receive prison sentences, and celebrities or public figures are socially buried. While such hardline policies are effective in preventing drug proliferation, there's also criticism that they treat addicts only as criminals, causing them to miss treatment opportunities. Recently, Korea has been operating a treatment custody system, attempting to send addicts to treatment facilities instead of prisons. In the 1980s, U.S. President Ronald Reagan drastically cut social welfare budgets under the banner of small government. Deinstitutionalization, closing psychiatric hospitals, was the right direction from a human rights perspective. The problem was that they closed hospitals without community support systems. Mentally ill people had nowhere to go and flooded the streets. At the same time, crack cocaine became popular in the 1980s and opioids spread in the 1990s, causing explosive increases in drug addiction. Canada also cut social welfare and healthcare budgets during the 1990s fiscal crisis. Mental health services were reduced and public housing construction was halted. Ahead of the 2010 Winter Olympics, Vancouver pushed low-income residents to the outskirts as part of downtown redevelopment. The downtown east side where they concentrated remains a center of drug addiction today. During the same period, Korea was building its social safety net from the ground up. With the implementation of national health insurance for all citizens in 1989, expansion of social welfare systems in the 1990s, and enactment of the National Basic Livelihood Security Act in 2000, a social safety net was built alongside economic growth. There were shocks like the 1997 financial crisis, but basic medical and housing safety nets were maintained. But an important question remains here. Does Korea really have no drug addicts? The answer is no. Korea has also seen a sharp increase in drug-related crimes and drug addicts recently. They're just hiding in jjilbangs, PC rooms, small rooms, goshiwons, and studio apartments. Families hide them and they hide themselves. In other words, North America has a visible crisis, while Korea has an invisible crisis. It's difficult to say which approach is better. North America can face the problem but cannot solve it, while Korea hides and neglects the problem. The real solution is to view addiction as an illness rather than a crime, focus on treatment rather than punishment, and provide integrated support for housing, medical care, and rehabilitation. Countries like Portugal and Switzerland have already shown successful cases. The reason for different street scenes ultimately comes down to the difference in how we treat the most vulnerable people. Will we leave them on the streets, neglect them in hidden spaces, or truly help them? The answer is for our society to choose. Thank you for watching. Your subscriptions, likes, and notifications mean a great deal to me.